I remember the first time I heard Vittorio Russo's story. It wasn't in some grand hall of success stories, where victorious lives compete for applause. No, it was in a quiet diner, tucked away behind a veil of rain and neon, where a friend told me about a wounded soldier who returned from war with nothing but the clothes on his back and a spine forged in fire. Vittorio wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't anointed by fate. Instead, he was carried home on a stretcher, shrapnel in his leg, but a stubborn dream flickering in his mind. I will never let myself depend on anyone again. As I listened, something in his story echoed through me, a faint resonance like the memory of distant thunder. For a long time, I told myself that I was nothing like those heroes who rise from ashes. My battlefield had no barbed wire, no barracks. But every day, I felt the squeeze, a constant silent battle with debts, bills, and a fear I never quite put into words. If you're anything like me, you know what I mean. That twitch in your stomach when you think about money, that shadow trailing every financial decision. The way a simple phone call from an unknown number spikes your pulse because you expect it to be another collection agency or just another expense waiting to pounce. We fight quieter wars now, often invisible from the outside, but no less relentless. They start before the sun rises and don't end at nightfall. I used to believe there was something different about those who climbed out of ruin. Maybe they were braver, luckier, born with some secret map I could never read. But stories like Vittorio's pierced that belief. Because he started in chaos, selling scraps from the wreckage while everyone around him scraped together hope from memories. He was just a young man in a city of scars, learning how to turn broken steel into bread and debt into drive. He didn't wait for rescue. He built something, piece by piece, starting with what little he still owned, his will. That was the question that haunted me as I wrestled with my own doubts. What separates those who merely survive from those who rise, not just out of desperation, but into genuine freedom? Not just scraping by, but building a life sturdy enough that no one could take it away. Not circumstance, not luck, not the whims of someone in charge of a paycheck or a policy. I felt that question echo every time I lay awake staring at my ceiling, tracing the cracks and wondering which one would crumble first, my next bill, or my belief in the possibility of change. I know the look in the eyes of people who have given up hope that anything beyond struggle is even possible. I've worn that look myself, in the mirror, the lines deepening with every new burden. And I realize now, that's what connects us across distance and time. Not just wounds, but the quiet, almost embarrassing yearning for more. For dignity, for opportunity, for a day when we don't have to flinch at an envelope in the mail, or feel shame as we swipe a card and silently hope it goes through. The world has never stopped changing, but some battles repeat themselves in new disguises. Just as Vittorio stared at a devastated landscape and decided to build, we face ruins of our own, broken bank accounts, dreams in foreclosure, generational habits we can't seem to shake. Still, lurking below the surface is a restless hunger, an urge to reclaim our power, forge our own path, and never again be left at the mercy of forces we cannot control. That longing is where our journey starts. Not at victory, not yet, but at that tingling point where pain meets the stubborn refusal to surrender. If you've ever wondered whether another way is possible, if you're carrying invisible wounds from financial struggles no one else can see, you're not alone here. I carry them too. We're about to walk a path drawn not by luck, but by choice, guided by the footsteps of a young man who built an empire from the ruins of wartime, and by the quiet revolutions happening every day, in stories like yours and mine. Somewhere in this journey, as we unravel these scars and build new strength, we just might find that freedom is crafted not from what we once feared, but from what we decide to believe and do next. When I first began to question everything I'd been taught about money, it was that winter when the radiator clanked to life each morning, steam hissing in the pipes, and I counted the bills stacked in my glove compartment at stoplights. A cold realization crept over me. My beliefs about prosperity had steep roots, sprawling beneath my choices like the knotted roots of an old oak tree. These weren't simply numbers on a page, but attitudes inherited from tense voices in cramped kitchens, worries handed down like sweaters patched and repatched until their original color vanished. Sometimes, late at night, I would remember the way my father once stared at a grocery receipt, pressing his thumb hard against his forehead, muttering, "We can't ever get ahead." His words weren't a lesson, merely a sigh, but it became a quiet refrain echoing through my thoughts long after I could have named its source. Even as a kid raking leaves for quarters, I absorbed the ambient anxiety humming in every conversation about money. My grandmother, her hands always working dough or darning socks, shared stories of pinched mornings and soup stretched thin so no one would go hungry, all the while reassuring me that the rich get richer, the poor stay poor. Over time, these messages wound themselves into my thinking, unchallenged, dictating what felt possible. Looking back, I see how seamlessly these attitudes slipped into every decision, like an unseen hand nudging me away from dreams that seemed extravagant. If an opportunity looked risky, I'd hear that inner voice whisper, "People like us aren't meant for big swings." When friends talked about investments, I'd freeze, immediate skepticism and discomfort rising as if I'd trespassed where I didn't belong. It amazed me how these ghosts from childhood still directed the show, long after I moved out of that apartment, long after I learned to fill up the tank completely without adding up the price. Yet these subconscious influences aren't limited to family anecdotes. Cultural rhythms tap their own beat, infusing us with assumptions so widespread they go unnoticed. Back in college, my roommate Gina, her own background punctuated by feast and famine cycles, once tossed her books on our chipped wooden table and said with a wry laugh, "Money isn't for people like us to keep, only to spend." She shrugged, as if shrugging off possibility itself. It was clear society plays its part, scripting lines about what's normal, what's greedy, what's even allowed to be hoped for. Even within tight-knit communities, differences in upbringing carved sharp lines. One neighbor down the hall, Mr. Peterson, wore pressed shirts and gold cufflinks, and I'd hear him say at barbecues, "Make money work for you, not the other way around." That notion felt so foreign, like a dialect I'd never learned. So many of my beliefs, I realized, didn't come from proven fact, but repetition and environment. A catchy tune I'd never thought to rewrite. A friend of mine, Sam, cracked his own narrative once his daughter asked, "Is being rich bad?" That innocent question triggered an avalanche of introspection. He saw his reflexive distrust in wealth as a hand-me-down bias, shaped by old stories of haves and have-nots. Over coffee, he confided in me, "I never thought of money as neutral, just a tool. I always saw it as a test I was destined to fail." We sat there, spoons stirring half-melted ice cubes, realizing what we'd both inherited was less a ledger and more a legacy of limits. What started to shift, deep in my bones, was understanding how these scripts shaped not only my choices, but my emotional thermostat around every transaction. Even as the world whirled forward, technology, new opportunities, the glitter of other people's ambitions plastered across social media, the echoes of old beliefs still paced just out of sight. The freedom to imagine another way, I began to see, demanded uncovering those legacies first. In moments of boldness, I dared to picture different possibilities, then noticed the immediate tug back toward caution and shrinkage, the way an elastic band snaps back to its original shape. Only when I paused, really traced the words and feelings around these automatic reactions, did I begin to entertain the idea. What if my ideas about wealth, work, and worth weren't entirely mine to begin with? What if new scripts could be chosen, written consciously instead of unconsciously repeated? With that question simmering beneath my skin, I found myself peering beneath the surface of my habits, growing eager to mine new meaning instead of reliving predetermined fates. The prospect no longer felt remote, but intensely personal, an uncharted territory waiting beyond the borders drawn in someone else's ink. Rain lashed the narrow windows that evening as I sank into the old armchair, legs curled beneath me and journal in hand. Flickering lamplight spilled across the pages, illuminating more than ink. I started scribbling. At first, only idle calculations and mundane lists, but soon, unexpected memories surfaced, accompanied by gut-deep realizations. I caught myself reflecting on statements I'd heard at the factory. "You're either born with a silver spoon or you'll always be scraping by." Lines like these lingered in my mind, unexamined, wielding invisible influence over my decisions. But that night, I craved something more. I put on my boots and padded down the creaky stairs, eager to lose myself in the crowd at old Maria's Corner Cafe. The place was alive, pulsing with weekend energy. Steam rose from chipped mugs, laughter mingled with the low hum of jazz, and at the worn counter sat Tommaso, known in our neighborhood for rebuilding engines out of junkyard heaps. I joined him, and after some small talk, he leaned in, his voice almost drowned by a trumpet riff. They say you need money to make money, but I started with less than nothing. His eyes glinted, recalling the night he sold his last bicycle to buy his first toolbox. Truth is, some rules exist only until you test them. I learned that old myths are just hand-me-downs, waiting to be outgrown. A shift stirred within me. I realized I'd accepted so many supposed certainties at face value, beliefs masquerading as laws, quietly dictating my boundaries. Tommaso's story landed differently. There was grit, sure, but also a practical wisdom. Step beyond the imaginary lines, and suddenly, possibilities emerge. It struck me that pervasive myths aren't simply stories. They're self-fulfilling blueprints restricting what we attempt. The phrase, "there's never enough to go around," often justified my hesitation to seek raises or expand my skills. Yet Tommaso, and many like him, proved otherwise, time and again. Furthermore, I recalled another voice, a middle school teacher named Mrs. Callahan. Sharp-witted, kind, she used to say, "Fear keeps more people broke than failure ever could." Initially, those words slid past me, abstract and untouchable. But one morning, years later, slapped by an overdraft fee and paralyzed by embarrassment, her words returned, stinging. I'd avoided asking for help or learning new strategies, all because deep down, fear of being judged or misstepping loomed larger than any financial obstacle itself. As I returned home that evening, lights from passing cars painting fleeting patterns across my window, I faced the silent power of these internal scripts. They weren't simply inherited. They were reinforced each time I chose comfort over challenge. Yet in the stories of Tommaso's toolbox, Mrs. Callahan's breezy warnings, and the laughter bouncing off chipped walls at Maria's, I saw evidence that old assumptions can be uprooted. Next morning, determined to forge new neural pathways, I taped a note to my mirror. What if limits disguised as truths are only waiting to be replaced? Each day, I tested this with concrete affirmation. Instead of repeating familiar lines of lack, I whispered, "Resources flow to me as I learn and grow." With time, it took root, guiding my attention toward new solutions. When doubts crept in, those restless, insistent shadows, I challenged them aloud, reframing. Mistakes mark learning, not endings. Small statements, perhaps, but spoken often enough, they began to loosen the iron grip of defeatism within me. No myth can withstand the steady force of conscious challenge. Gradually, I started trusting in the possibility of my expansion, even when evidence appeared scarce. As the world outside the window flickered between storm and sunrise, I realized each day offers new chances to rewrite our stories, one belief, one daring affirmation at a time. The clock on my wall ticked louder than usual as I reached for the battered notebook I'd hidden at the back of a drawer, a place where old bills, faded Polaroids, and scribbled dreams coexisted in uneasy truce. I needed something more than inspirational quotes or whispered reassurances tonight. Weariness lined my every movement, but still, a faint ember of determination pressed me forward. If believing in new truths required action, I needed a ritual to ignite momentum. So, I started my own experiment. I chose to focus, every morning, on gratitude, not in the vague sense teachers sometimes mention, but with the intent to hunt for things overlooked. The hum of the refrigerator, the flavor of strong coffee, distant laughter from the apartment across the courtyard. I cataloged each small victory, whether finding a forgotten $5 bill in my coat pocket or realizing a bill was smaller than anticipated. The shift wasn't thunderous, it was soft, like water carving stone over centuries. Yet day by day, this routine gave my mind a different type of fuel. As the habit solidified, I noticed an odd transformation, a steadying of emotions, a calming of the old financial anxiety that would once spiral unchecked. Progress demanded more, though. Frustration used to bubble up whenever my plans unraveled or opportunities slipped through my fingers. Rather than letting that negative surge derail my energy, I began capturing every moment of regret before it bloomed into self-blame. I turned to the page. Journaling wasn't a reflection on the past, but a workshop for the future. I learned to question my own patterns. Why did I hesitate to negotiate at work? What, exactly, made me bristle at the idea of tracking expenses? As I wrote, answers floated up. Memories, yes, but more than that, obstacles I could pick apart and redesign. The process was often raw, sometimes embarrassing, but it clarified where I had been waiting for permission to choose differently. Determined not to let these insights evaporate by mid-afternoon, I found a new way to carry them into daily action. Visualization became a lifeline. Each evening, before the city lights winked on, I'd close my eyes and imagine moving through a scenario where confidence guided my response to unexpected costs or potential windfalls. Instead of shrinking, I pictured myself standing taller, negotiating agreements, asking for clarity instead of shrinking into silence. This internal rehearsal, at first awkward, gained a visceral quality over time, like learning a language through repetition until phrases flow without conscious effort. While gratitude refocused my energy and journaling unearthed internal roadblocks, visualization forged a map. Yet, these interior tools needed a foothold in my habits, so I committed to the smallest of daily actions, setting aside loose change for a specific purpose, tracking receipts without judgment, researching one constructive financial topic per week. Even little wins, a discount at the grocery store, resisting an impulsive buy, became proof that intention and discipline could manifest tangibly. Curiously, each step planted new seeds. Recognizing minor wins sparked a snowball effect. My resolve stiffened, not because the numbers transformed overnight, but because I finally recognized my own agency. The fuel from deliberate gratitude, the clarity from honest journaling, and the confidence from vivid mental rehearsal blended into motivation. Some days, caution intervened. Whispers of old skepticism still lingered, but momentum accrued through the act of showing up, choice after choice, even as uncertainty shadowed the path ahead. As I left the coffee shop one rain-soaked afternoon, receipts crumpled in my pocket and a day's small triumphs swirling in my head, I saw how these subtle rituals became the bedrock for lasting change. The path wasn't about grand gestures or overnight reinvention. Rather, it was a tapestry woven from tiny, conscious acts, building strength inside, reinforcing it through honest practice, and mapping new possibilities with each deliberate step forward. These methods were quietly rewriting the story of what I could create. And as that realization settled, a deeper momentum gathered, pressing me on with a sense of possibility utterly my own. As I exited the clattering subway, autumn chill pressing insistently against my collar, a flash of gold at my feet halted my usual brisk stride. A shiny key, likely lost by a hurried commuter, glinted up from the stained concrete. I pocketed it on impulse, a small but tangible reminder that unexpected opportunity can materialize where we least anticipate. Later that week, as I waited in line at Mason's Hardware, I found myself studying the faces around me, each no doubt carrying their own loads, ambitions, and private calculations. Unlike the routines I'd been cultivating, which steadily rebuilt my internal foundation, a different kind of transformation was taking root: identity. This shift was less about tactics and rituals. It was a courageous act of redefining what I stood for. One Thursday, at a birthday dinner for my friend Carla, conversation turned to dreams, those secret hopes we rarely voice but keep quietly alive. Carlo admitted, over a forkful of cake, "I've always wanted to run my own store, but I still see myself as an employee, like it's cast in stone." Nobody at the table scoffed. Her words actually summoned a vulnerable silence, because we understood the magnitude of those invisible boundaries. Engraved in each of us was a self-image, sometimes lovingly handed down, sometimes carved by experiences sharp as broken glass. For years, I thought myself bad with numbers, training my focus on what was safe, rarely daring to imagine leading a project, much less envisioning myself as anyone's advisor or boss. There's something shocking, even raw, in noticing that every financial choice is really an act of self-definition. When I first started setting aside small sums for a future goal, it wasn't about the figures, it was a statement. I am someone who plans, who shapes my own horizon. Momentum gathered as I mingled with people who challenged my familiar picture of success. Take Marcus, the night security guard in my building, who spent his breaks studying design software, plotting his escape from a life lived by someone else's agenda. One evening he said, "You ever realize you're living out someone else's story?" His words lingered, burrowing deeper than I admitted. Identity, I saw, is plastic, not a prison but clay. Every time Marcus took on a freelance assignment, he chipped away at a legacy of resignation, gradually sculpting a new narrative for himself and his son. Moreover, as my own confidence wobbled between possibility and past patterns, I witnessed how easily value gets entwined with material results. There was a moment at work when I introduced a productivity improvement idea, flushing scarlet as colleagues weighed its merit. Their reactions were icy, but I stood by my suggestion and watched over weeks as it bore fruit, even earning acknowledgement uptown. Each step strained my self-concept, pulling it wider even as doubts nipped at the seams. Nonetheless, by persisting, I was quietly affirming a role beyond spectator. Intertwining prosperity with ethical intention became another dimension entirely. On Sundays, my neighbor Elaine delivered food from her garden to elderly locals, not for applause, but because dignity, to her, meant sharing surplus. In following her example, I discovered that security and generosity are kin, not rivals. When we lead lives defined by wholesome principles, curiosity, resilience, compassion, our relationship with earning and stewardship transforms. Emotional maturity, I learned, reveals itself not by the size of our wallets, but by how comfortably we inhabit our roles as creators, contributors, and benefactors. Thus, to claim a renewed identity is to ground ambition in purpose, a story powered by self-respect rather than scarcity. Stepping into new shoes, we carry others up with us, crafting legacies rooted in intention and integrity. It's not the origin of our narrative that counts, but the audacious reimagining of endings, day after courageous day. Wind rattled the loose pane in my living room as I sat at my desk, staring at a blank page, a subtle echo of the restlessness inside me. In that quiet, I remembered the morning I followed my uncle into his workshop. Sunlight sliced through the dust, casting strange patterns on the wall, while he hunched over a battered radio, coaxing it to life. "You want to see how this works?" he asked, offering a rusty toolkit with a wink. I hesitated. My hands weren't used to delicate parts or the patience he wore like a badge. He gestured again. "Try it, you'll figure it out." Curiosity smothered my doubt, and with a trembling screwdriver, I took a risk. Even as sparks popped and static spat in protest, a small surge of pride flickered. It wasn't mastery, but something new, the beginning of agency, a taste of authorship. Fast forward to recent weeks, and I've come to recognize an entirely fresh layer in this journey, a kind of internal contract we sign with ourselves. This isn't about fixing, mending, or even aspiring anymore. Now, it's a process of daily renewal. Commitment, in this phase, isn't a roaring pledge made in a single, dramatic flash. Instead, it's relentless, a river shaping stone, drop by drop, every decision carving out a new landscape inside us. When temptation calls, asking me to skip one small step or break a promise to myself, that's the exact moment this practice becomes real. No 2 days look identical. Discipline is often unglamorous. Take, for example, the way I've built routines around tracking progress. Each evening, I mark one action, tiny, measurable, but non-negotiable. Yesterday, it meant 10 minutes spent reviewing transactions. Tomorrow, maybe a call to renegotiate a bill. Sometimes, these acts look insignificant to outsiders, yet strung together, they forge the resilience I once only admired in stories. There were evenings when every fiber screamed in protest. Fatigue clung to my bones, distractions blared from every corner, and still, the single task offered a foothold. Again, just this step, I'd tell myself, as if laying bricks for a secret fortress only I understood. Gradually, this dedication shifted from burden to habit, and then into something electric, belief that realignment is always possible. The repetition acted like an anchor, each completed action, evidence that I could direct my journey, regardless of turbulence. It wasn't just resolve. It grew into a welcome familiarity, a steady companion dampening that urged to sabotage progress with impatience or self-doubt. Yet commitment without renewal becomes stagnant. I learned to punctuate each week with a ritual, long walks at dusk, headphones blaring a playlist compiled for this purpose alone. As the rhythm pulsed, my mind wandered through every recent success and setback. Sometimes, sharp disappointment would surface, taunting me with mistakes. Other times, pride would bloom quietly, reminding me that every corrected misstep is a victory as valid as any triumph. These walks became unofficial audits, opportunities to recalibrate intention, to release grudges against myself, and double down on what truly mattered. Unexpectedly, the most powerful moments arrived disguised as setbacks. Once, I missed a target that seemed crucial, an extra payment I'd planned to make. Instead of spiraling, I wrote my future self a letter, describing how this moment of delay was just a bend, not the end. The exercise felt awkward, but in translating disappointment into narrative, a new feeling of forgiveness arose. I promised to be relentless, but also kind. Bringing self-empathy into this period of sustained growth helped me avoid the trap of rigid perfectionism, a lesson it took me years to embrace. Underlying these habits now beats a steady drum. The commitment to re-envision identity, not just as a product of circumstance, but as an ongoing creation. With every intention affirmed, every misstep acknowledged and recovered from, I discover new dimensions to the promise I made myself in that dusty workshop and in every quiet night since. No matter what the world throws my way, I will meet myself with both tenacity and grace, one choice, one day at a time. Reflecting on this journey so far, I sense the subtle transformation that comes only after crossing through shadows and emerging into a clearer dawn. Brick by mindful brick, those first tremors of change have grown into a steady undertow, pulling me forward with a purpose I didn't fully recognize at the outset. The narrative I've been weaving, strand after stubborn strand, has taken on a surprising momentum, like roots pushing through packed earth, patient and persistent, undeterred by momentary resistance. One crisp evening, I found myself lingering on a bus bench, watching traffic unravel into strands of gold and red beneath the city's streetlights. As silence draped itself over the crowd, I realized something had quietly taken root within me, a gathering of intention and self-trust that was both unfamiliar and resolute. No longer pressed against the glass of possibility, nose smudged by doubt, I sensed a different vantage point beginning to unfold. Each lesson encountered, each behavioral experiment tried, converged much like tributaries feeding into a swelling river, directionless at first, but gradually coalescing into current. Familiar landscapes now reveal quiet variations I'd failed to notice before. How anticipation sits in the pit of my stomach, softer than anxiety, yet sharper than nostalgia. Even habitual alcoves where uncertainty liked to roost now feel spacious, as if I've flung open windows on a stifling day, letting something vital sweep in and scatter the old air. I think of changes as these hidden revolutions, unseen until they suddenly break into my consciousness like sunlight through a crack, illuminating what was always possible but rarely considered. It startles me sometimes, the way inner shifts manifest outwardly in the smallest of ways. A new willingness to linger over opportunities instead of retreating, a softer response to setbacks that once ignited old scripts. As if by picking up a thread and weaving patiently, a larger tapestry has begun to reveal itself, not merely a patchwork of strategies, but a coherent narrative where each motif supports the next. I find it's less about effort and more about alignment. Something within has started humming in tune. On mornings when I'm restless, toes curled into the cool kitchen tile, I hear echoes of past hesitations, their voices fainter as I reach for a different cup, one filled with questions that invite, rather than repel, a richer engagement. It's almost as if the scaffolding that held up a narrower outlook has dropped away, replaced, not with certainty, but with an openness to whatever unfolds. Even conversations with friends and colleagues have adopted a timbre of curiosity. Our dialogues dart like swallows at dusk, brave, searching, sometimes trembling but always pressing onward. If I close my eyes, I can almost feel the texture of possibility, grainy yet smooth to the touch, offering both friction and comfort. No single revelation has lit the way. Instead, layers of insight and practice have settled, one atop the next, until looking back, the old landscape feels nearly unrecognizable. The distance covered was not marked by grand gestures, but by myriad quiet decisions accumulating in secret, building a threshold I now stand upon. As dusk unfurls, and I trace with my fingertip the line where shadow meets light, it's clear that a crucial intersection approaches. All these experiences, raw, tentative, bold, draw together into a momentum impossible to ignore. The air itself seems to bristle with potential, inviting me to take one last breath before stepping fully into whatever comes next, ready to embrace the culmination this entire journey has quietly prepared me to meet. Light seeped in across my windowsill, softer than yesterday, more forgiving, less hurried. I sat at my kitchen table, fingertips tracing patterns in the steam spiraling from my favorite mug. The city beyond faded into a calming blur, and for a rare moment, I could simply breathe and listen to the gentle weight of all that had shifted in me. Across the scuffed tabletop, my story felt newly alive, a tapestry of trial, hope, and small, irrepressible triumphs, woven not of chance but steady, waking choice. A knock sounded at my door, startling me out of reverie. It was Sophia, my neighbor, a loyal friend, always rushing, always purposeful in her stride. Today, she moved more slowly, holding her little boy's hand, worry flickering across her features. "Do you ever feel," she asked as her son drummed absent-mindedly on her knee, "like you're building a future out of thin air?" Her voice was soft, almost wondering, and something in it drew forth a tenderness I'd been saving for myself. We sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to laughter and footsteps echo down the hallway. The past, once a wall, now felt porous, allowing sunlight and memory to mingle gracefully. Sharing coffee, together we searched for comfort in silence and strength in the willingness to try again, to believe we can remake what feels broken. In Sophia's eyes and in the easy sprawl of her son across the couch, I saw reflections of all those who hesitate at the open door of change, brimming with apprehension and yet, underneath, a shimmering determination. As stories spilled between us, the steady tick of clock hands measured out our small courage, quiet but tenacious. We swapped doubts and old embarrassments, recalling phone calls we'd once dreaded, opportunities we almost refused, futures we feared might close before us. Yet as the afternoon stretched, what lingered was a new cadence, one born of many tiny acts, a sort of music only audible when hearts beat in alignment with what feels possible. Later, after Sophia and her boy wandered home, I lingered at my window, gaze landing on the distant wavering of lights, each one a silent testament to lives unfolding, decisions mounting, dreams mulled in private twilight. There's a hush at dusk when the hush itself feels like an answer, and I understood then that freedom isn't a finish line, nor is security a fortress built overnight. It's movement, imperfect but persistent, propelled by refusal to let fear mute hope or to let old limitations set our borders. That night, as quiet settled over me, I let gratitude and anticipation tangle together. If there's a singular revelation I carry forward, it's this. Everything that matters blooms from a humble seed, a promise to act, again and again, regardless of origin or setback. Our legacy isn't forged in spectacular victories, but in the quiet insistence to believe, build, and tend what's ours to shape. Even where the ground feels barren, the impulse to rise, daring, ordinary, defiant, holds the power to turn any landscape into foundation. Every new day, with its uncertain light and unclaimed possibilities, is an invitation. And so, I step forward, no longer weighed down or waiting for permission, but alive to the truth that the shape of my freedom, our freedom, will always be drawn by the courage to begin.